is not okay. Even if the narcissistic person doesn't change a bit, it can be enough to help you feel more sane, more safe, and to ultimately trust your instincts and perhaps kind of go off and maybe ally with others and figure out a plan together. I know that when I have been in toxic systems where nobody said anything, that physically over time I feel sick. But sometimes all it took was one person saying, "Yo, everyone, this doesn't feel cool." Or when I felt more empowered, me being the person to do it. When that would happen, I would start feeling a little normal again. The narcissistic person, interestingly, who is making all the problems in the system, wouldn't change. But the rest of us didn't feel so crazy. Elie Wiesel says, silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. So however we speak up, it's important that we do. But the challenge is, there's tormentors that really are doing things that seem sort of in your face, that people are going to breaking the law, and they're going to get fired, or that we're going to shut them down. But a lot of what happens in narcissistic systems is subtle. And a lot of people write it off as, their bark's worse than their bite. They don't really mean it. Oh, they're old. That's how they've always been. Still silence, and people are still being tormented. Now, you know me, you're thinking, like, Dr. Ron, you sure this fellow not call them out? Yep, and I don't think you should if you're not empowered to do so. But when you are, and even if it's later on, and I've even said this, when you're going to call out gaslighting, sometimes you can't do it in real time. You don't have the power in the situation. It could end up causing some significant blowback for you. You might lose a job even or something. The person who was gaslighted later on, you can tell them, no, that wasn't okay. But that still doesn't have the power of someone who is emboldened enough to be able to say, this is not okay. Game changer. This is the kind of thing that has turned people's lives around. When they've had one time in their life where somebody basically somebody called BS on the narcissistic person's behavior. Like I said, the narcissistic person's behavior is not going to change. But there's a danger when systems don't call stuff out. This isn't about one person calling the narcissist out. This is about a group coming together and saying this isn't okay. The original inspiration for this video actually came from a book I was reading about the experience of someone in a cult. And one of the things that this person said was, all of us were seeing the same thing. And if all of us had spoken out, this cult would have been shut down. But the cult leader had created such individual terror in each member that even though everyone was looking around saying, this isn't cool, they were still not able to band together. And because of that, a lot of harm came to a lot more people before it did finally get shut down. Now, I know you may not be thinking about your narcissistic system as a cult, but it's pretty damn similar. So think about that. And you may not be able to do it alone, but somehow that strength in numbers, when you can, please do, because it's a real danger when we don't.
Why?
Remember that a lot of narcissistic relationship happens in your head. You try to convince yourself that things were better than they actually were. And you can start believing that pseudo-reality and grieve the story that you made up in your head. Today I'm going to be offering you some tips, 10 ways to become more resistant to narcissists. My goal in doing this work, obviously, is to help people recover, but a bigger goal would be to help whenever possible keep people from getting into these relationships in the first place. And if they're in them, at least help them from getting sucked in too much deeper. Now, I'm offering 10 ways. As you listen to this video, if there are tips you have for becoming more resistant to narcissists that work for you, could you? Because, again, please subscribe to this channel because honestly, this community often gives a tremendous amount of useful feedback, and the comments becomes its own sort of piece of guidance on these videos. But let's take this on. What are 10 ways that you can become more resistant to narcissists in all areas of your life?
That's cool.
For me, working with people all these years on managing the narcissists in their lives, one thing I've learned is one, Simple truth. In an ideal world, you don't let them in the first place. But I know that guidance is a day late and a dollar short for lots of you who are already deeply in these messes. And that guidance is useless if this is a narcissistic parent or sibling in which you had no choice in the situation. However, if you could learn some of these strategies for how to become more resistant, you may be able to shut the gate on future narcissists and perhaps also learn to keep yourself a little bit more sane with the ones who are already in your life. Number one, please learn to own your truth and own your reality. If you can do this, then you, simply put, have gaslight repellent. The reason gaslighting works is because we give the other person too much credit and we don't give ourselves enough. This may happen because we perceive the other person to be smart, or for some reason you believe they're credible. And because you don't value your own opinion enough. The first time your reality is questioned by someone, step back, pay attention, and seriously consider cutting bait. Number two, stop falling for charisma and charm. Somewhere along the line, we were told that charismatic and charming people are somehow valuable or interesting. And maybe that's because the charismatic and charming people get to make the rules. As far as I'm concerned, charisma is like heavy perfume or cologne that someone wears when they don't take a shower. It's probably covering something else. Tread very carefully when someone is larger than life or intoxicating or seductive or oh so silver-tongued. I know this is the opposite of everything you have ever been taught. And most people tell me, though, sadly, they fell for the charm and the charisma. We've been programmed to do this, but don't fall for it. If you encounter a charming and charismatic person, you really need to make an effort to pay attention to what they are saying. Remember, number three, remember that just being smart or educated is not a virtue. Listen, I am educated. I worked hard for it. I also think I'm a nice person. But my education is not what made me a nice person. I know plenty of really educated and really smart people out there who are very toxic and cruel and unkind. Do not fall into the trap of thinking that someone who is smart or intellectually gifted or educated, that somehow those things are virtues. Being smart is just a trick. It means you know stuff. If you're smart, then good for you. But all of us need to remember that far more important is kindness and compassion, that those are virtues. Being smart is not a virtue. Keep that straight so you keep your guard up and get to know someone before giving them the benefit of the doubt just because they're smart. Many of us don't always feel comfortable with our intellects, so it's very easy to get snowed by a smart person. Number four, speaking of that, don't get snowed by rich and successful people. Now, this is a riff on that smart one. There is a belief that people who are rich and who are successful are somehow doing something right. And maybe they are. Or maybe they're just lucky. Or maybe they inherited it. Or maybe they did something shady to get it. The risk becomes that the assumption is that they are somehow better than you, better than me, which can set up a power imbalance into which it is easier for them to gaslight you. The same mistake can be made around fame or celebrity. Halos can be drawn around people who are toxic just because they are famous or fancy. Don't fall for it. Whether a person is a prince or a pauper, pay attention to their words and their actions. And don't imbue them with virtue just because they're successful. Number five, watch how they treat other people. This can be tricky because narcissists are so two-faced. They are masterful at putting on a great public face and treating those close to them very badly behind closed doors. But if you pay attention to how they treat who they would consider to be, I don't know, lower status people or people who make mistakes where they're concerned. For example, the unfortunate server who may make an error in their order or somebody who calls them out. Watch how they treat those people and watch how they talk about other people. Odds are that before too long, they're going to be talking about you in the same way. Number 6, learn the narcissist's tells. If you're a poker player, you know, a big way you win, other than getting good cards, is learning the other player's tells. Tells are their little twitches, nonverbal movements, the way they react to their cards. It can give you a lot of information. Narcissists are no different. Their ultimate tell is to watch how they behave under conditions of frustration or disappointment. That's where you usually see it. Their usually charming facade will fade to anger, rage, and contempt when things don't go their way. Don't write excuses for them. Number 7, become okay with setting boundaries. No is a complete sentence. It's okay to say no, to not succumb to what feels like intrusive behavior just because someone wants what they want.
Yep.
Entitled people are more than willing to take their half out of the middle. Boundaries are your way of saying no. Too many people who are vulnerable to narcissists are generally people pleasers. And one thing that people pleasers are not good at is at setting boundaries. Set those boundaries. Hold those boundaries. Is the narcissist going to get mad? You better believe it. Learn to tolerate their discomfort instead of succumbing by constantly being the one who compromises for them. Number 8, dump the enablers. The narcissists are only part of your problem. The enablers are the rest of the issue. You may be able to start nudging the narcissist out, but the enablers are yet another vector of toxicity. The enablers are often the ones who continue to gaslight you and second guess you. If you are distancing and disengaging from the narcissist, you need to do the same thing with the enablers. And this isn't easy because the enablers are quite often, they're actually not toxic themselves, but they live in a big cloud, a cloud of denial and not wanting to face down the toxic truth. And sadly, it's in this way that intergenerational patterns get passed down and persist. Number 9, stop giving second chances. Second chances are what give narcissists their power. In essence, it is you signing off on their behavior. And the orchestra of voices that's around you that want you to give them second chances include their enablers. Now, yes, I know it can seem abrupt to cut a person off after just one mistake. But after they make one mistake, just at least be on watch. After someone gaslights you once, be on watch. After someone is contemptuous and dismissive of you, be on watch. After a person is rageful and then tries to excuse it on the basis of a bad day, be on watch. Being on watch means that you pay attention to determine if this is a pattern rather than just excusing and erasing it. Second chances turn into 10,000th chances and a lifetime lost to the psychological abuse seen in narcissistic relationships. Number 10, surround yourself with good people. I mean, it seems like such basic guidance, right? But once narcissists start getting into your life, they are like invasive weeds that choke out the good stuff in your garden. Narcissists, as a rule, demand all of your time, and they get jealous when you give it to others. They often prefer to isolate and control people so they can get steady supply. And as
What
a
you
result,
doing?
you might find yourself giving
Mom, what's the
90% of
matter?
yourself to the toxic person or people in your life,
Oh,
giving you
we're back.
no bandwidth or time for the healthy people. And that's not going to be good for you. The healthy people are the ones who validate you, who are sounding boards, who do not gaslight you, who have your back, who encourage you to pursue your dreams,
What are you
who have
doing?
empathy, compassion, and kindness, and
What
listen
are
to
you
you,
doing,
and
sweet
you do
thing?
the same for them. If you have just some of these good people in your life, then you, on a website or someplace else, as a narcissistic abuse recovery expert,
What are you
doesn't always
doing?
necessarily mean they'll be a good fit for you.
Hmm?
They may be a good therapist for someone else, but if it doesn't feel good for you, it doesn't feel good for you. But it's also a
What are you
possibility
doing?
they've called themselves an expert, but they aren't. There are no, right now, we're still working on the credentialing around this. But be sure that in whoever you see for therapy, you feel safe or heard. Because there's a lot of therapists out there who don't call themselves narcissistic abuse experts, and there actually could be a really great fit for you. Other people,
Hello.
like I said, may call themselves this kind of an expert, and you don't really like
Come
them.
on over, Rover.
After going through
Where are you
narcissistic
going?
abuse, people don't always trust their instincts. Let this be the day, and let this be the process that leads you to starting to trust yours. If the therapy experience doesn't feel good, you have the right to step away and find another therapist. Don't worry about hurting the therapist's feelings. Number 10,
Oh.
consider rounding out therapy with support groups, but choose carefully. Some support groups may not be well moderated, so if the group doesn't feel right or safe, don't ever feel compelled to stick it out. But having
sit over here.
safe, good, well-moderated peer spaces and support spaces can be useful to your healing and growth and help you kind of derive strength
What's
and
that?
belonging from recognizing other people have been through
What's that?
this. Number 11, you got to do work between sessions. I'm one of many that strongly encourages journaling, list making, rituals, routines, cleaning out toxic folks, reading, getting educated, mindfulness. This is about a change in your whole life. And while therapy is important, the 167 hours or the work between sessions is crucially important as well. I'd love to have you drop a comment. What are some of the things, those of you who are sort of really doing the work to push back on narcissistic abuse, what's the work that you've done between sessions that's helped you? Number 12, be wary of anyone who says they'll snap you back into shape from narcissistic abuse in 6 weeks or some set amount of time. Healing is personal. There is no schedule. It's always a process. Some people take months, some people take years. That's fine. Number 13, work with a therapist who helps you identify any other issues that you may be experiencing, such as anxiety, depression, substance use, disordered eating, and then helps you and works with you to manage them alongside the narcissistic abuse patterns that you are experiencing. The narcissistic abuse is interlinked with the other stuff you're going through, and both issues need to be addressed simultaneously. It's not as simple as, oh, once we treat your anxiety, we'll circle back and we'll talk about that narcissistic abuse. Interdependent, have to be dealt with together. Now, ultimately, when it comes to therapy for narcissistic abuse, as of now, again, now it's time for us to start doing the research, but there's no sort of singular model that works best, but a good model includes trauma-informed practices, trust, not being blamed or invalidated by the therapist. For example, if anyone ever asks you the question, why did you stay so long? No. Good therapy includes grief work, education about the patterns of narcissism, specifically as to how they're relevant to your situation, awareness regarding dynamics such as gaslighting and how to fortify and strengthen yourself, techniques to address rumination, awareness about the intersectional and cultural issues that are relevant specifically to you, gender, race, you name it, and awareness of psychosocial issues like domestic violence or elder issues or custody issues, and connection to awareness of resources that could be useful.
Don't chew
The
on
therapist
that.
doesn't have to be an expert in this. They just need to know that these are important things. to seek out or even get consultation for themselves to help you. This whole world of narcissistic abuse is a complex and evolving space. And I'm telling you this again, as a last thought, I'm going to repeat this. If the therapeutic relationship doesn't feel good, then leave. Not all of us are a perfect match for every client. It's very hard for survivors of narcissistic abuse to value themselves enough to say that a given therapist doesn't feel right. But sometimes it doesn't. And it's important to find someone who works for you.
What are you doing?
You deserve
Crazy
at
little thing.
least that much. All of this is a process. Most people come out of this wiser, stronger, a bit battle scarred. But remember what Rumi says about those wounds, right? Those wounds are where the light enters us. So let therapy be a place of self-advocacy for you, of resilience building, of addressing what has harmed and hurt you. Let it be a place that is designed to help you, but never to blame you or shame you. So let's talk a little bit about the pattern of grief that is such a classical part of narcissistic abuse. This, to me, grief, may be one of the most difficult of all of the patterns, the fallout, if you will, of narcissistic abuse. I will be doing a series on grief after the loss of a narcissistic relationship in a few months. But for now, I want to break down some of the brass tacks of narcissistic relationship grief here because it is such a classical part, the sense of grief, of what a person going through a narcissistic relationship goes through. So for now, I'm really going to talk about grief as an artifact of narcissistic abuse. Grief is a response to loss. We traditionally think of it in terms of death, but it can also be loss of a relationship. For example, a divorce. You might see grief in the face of the loss of a job, the loss of a home, and we even can observe grief reactions during major transitions. For example, a person moving to a new city or a new country and leaving their home behind. Grief is a part of the human experience. And psychologists have been writing about it since there was psychology. And humans have been experiencing guilt since there were humans. We build rituals around grief, and every culture has some sort of system, every religion has some sort of system it uses to manage this experience of grief. We go through an experience called bereavement. That's a part of grief, which can feel like depression. It's a part of a natural part of the process of letting go. During a bereavement period, people are generally quite sad. But the grief of narcissistic abuse or associated with narcissistic abuse is very difficult because usually no one's dead. And the belief is that you should be relieved, for example, that the relationship is done. But still, you're sad. What are you grieving when you're experiencing narcissistic abuse? You're grieving lots of stuff. You're grieving what you believed would have been or could have been in this relationship. You're grieving your childhood. You're grieving your loss of trust. You're grieving your loss of faith in other human beings. You're grieving your lost opportunities. You are grieving the idea you have about what life could be about and what love could be about. You're grieving your belief that the world is fair and just. And that is a lot to grieve. If you experienced any form of narcissistic abuse as a child, you didn't understand that it was grief that was a part of what you were experiencing, even as a child. A childhood with a narcissistic parent can be chronically disappointing, largely because the narcissistic individual puts his or her needs ahead of everyone else. So there can be missed activities, missed deadlines, missed school events, missed everything that's the stuff of childhood. But there's also grief of that significant developmental window. This can result in a sense of melancholy that wafts through a childhood, a melancholy that is all too familiar to survivors of narcissistic abuse. It's a heaviness that we all carry in us. You'll see that lifelong survivors of narcissistic abuse smile, but there's a sadness that lurks right behind it. However, other survivors often typically see it and get it. In adulthood, decisions around maintaining relationships with your narcissistic parent or parents can get quite complicated. Their presence can sometimes trigger a sense of grief, the childhood loss, the relationship you had wanted to have with a parent. And since they probably didn't get it when you were a kid and probably aren't going to get it now, the same gaslighting and passive aggressive barbs continue to characterize your relationship. It's as though you play the grief over and over again every time you see them. In adult relationships with a partner, spouse, it can be quite similar. The relationship is or was quite miserable, and yet you grieve it when it's done. This is a classical part of narcissistic abuse and a confusing one when a relationship ends. Many people will mistake this sense of grief and think, oh no, maybe I made a mistake, I'm grieving this, and I can have it back, and then you fall back in. Remember that a lot of narcissistic relationship happens in your head. You try to convince yourself that things were better than they actually were. And you can start believing that pseudo reality and grieve the story that you made up in your head. The grief elements of narcissistic abuse are often experienced similarly to the depression piece, as well as other elements of narcissistic abuse: sadness, regret, confusion, anger, lots of negative mood states. But the confusion is the yearning that can still be there for you around that relationship. Odds are that the yearning you're experiencing is for things that either didn't exist in the relationship, the fantasy that you had to construct about the relationship, or are related to the trauma bond and the addictive compulsion to get back into it. And neither of those patterns are healthy. Healthy grief is a natural process that resolves over time, especially when there is support. There's a recent video I did on what happens when a narcissist in your life dies, and I talk about the complicated grief and the confusion that happens when someone with whom you've had such a complicated relationship with actually passes on. But the grief of narcissistic abuse happens whether the narcissist is alive or not. It's less about grieving the actual person, and in some ways becomes even more about grieving the hope you had had for that particular relationship, the time you may have lost to it, and the pieces of yourself you gave up to it. So, what do you do in the face of grief? First, always remember that grief is a natural process of letting go. Support it through therapy, through support groups, ideally for support groups designed for survivors of narcissistic abuse, other techniques such as mindfulness, meditation, and meaningful activities in your life. Second, don't let the grief confuse you. It isn't a sign that you did the wrong thing, but rather it's a natural process of letting go. And in the case of narcissistic abuse, a complicated process of letting go. Third, if the grief starts to careen into more substantial symptoms of depression or anxiety, then you must pay attention and you must consider therapy, because the key to addressing negative emotional symptoms such as depression and anxiety are to catch it early, or at a minimum, please consult your primary healthcare provider. Fourth, please consider journaling. It's a good process to see how you're slowly letting this relationship go over time. There will definitely be good days and bad days, triggered days and easier days. But over time, if you can witness the improvement, it can substantiate your commitment to growth and letting go. Fifth, There are really no true do-overs
Okay.
in life. There's no reset button. So acceptance becomes key. It can be painful to reflect on a childhood that might have been lost to narcissistic abuse or 20 or 30 or 40 years spent in a toxic marriage. No, you can't bring that time back by rumination. But a big part of the resolution of grief is acceptance. This is your life story, and it's rich and it's beautiful, and you learned a lot. If you've survived narcissistic abuse, you are actually stronger than most people. Take that strength and use that time that you have in front of you, see it as a gift, and please use it well. So I'm going to talk to you about something that's very, very interesting. People who are in narcissistic relationships are often struck about where the grief hits them. They'll just be kind of reading a book, and a very common one is watching something, and they'll be surprised by it. So this is really going to take that on. The surprising place that narcissistic grief can sneak up on you. Okay? And again, this is a very interesting phenomenon I've noticed. The grief over a narcissistic relationship is a very, very unique grief. Okay? So it's not the sort of grief of what we typically associate with loss, like you see someone dying or relationship ending or losing a job. It's not even the grief of losing something like a house burning down or a car getting totaled or losing stuff in a burglary or in a robbery, which are losses which can lead to grief. The grief of a narcissistic relationship is something more unique. It's the loss of a narrative, a loss of innocence. It's the loss, it can be the loss of a family, a loss of hope, a loss of what you hoped life could be, a loss of time, a loss of potential, a loss of opportunity. People waste years in these relationships. And then, once they see it clearly, regret all that had been lost. People maintain narratives about happy families. They would wonder why there was an incongruence, a disconnect between what they so desperately wanted to be true and what the situation in front of them actually was. And that moment of recognition is characterized by grief. These are losses, but because they are losses, you carry in your heart, in your mind, and in your soul that they may not look like losses to people around you. And you may go through this bizarre experience of grief that you don't even identify as grief. So that's why so many people are going through this thing. I feel like I'm losing my mind. No, it's actually grief. Now, what this video takes on is how this grief sneaks up on you in a very, very interesting and surprising way. It comes up when you're watching a movie or a TV show. It's amazing how often I have talked with many, many survivors of narcissistic relationships and narcissistic abuse who will talk about how a scene in a movie or show that, I don't know, the scene in the movie or the show isn't even really that consequential. But the survivor will actually find themselves tearful and really sad and not be able to hold those tears back. For example, maybe a scene
Babies.
empathic towards a child, where a father is loving towards the family. It could be any number of compassionate scenes from a marriage. But what catches people who have been through narcissistic relationships by surprise is the strength, how overpowered they feel, the strength of their reaction, especially to scenes that weren't even meant to be that evocative. In fact, some people have said they were actually a little bit embarrassed because the scene which made them cry wasn't actually, probably not even intended to be a tearjerker scene,
Nope.
but in the context of their lives, of their unique griefs, that the simple act of maybe kindness or sacrifice by a character in a film, versus like a partner or a parent, represented something
What are you
they
doing?
so desperately yearned for, and finally recognized that they would never get, and would be watching that all play out in a story and just almost amplifying the thing that was missing from their lives. If you have experienced narcissistic abuse, just take a minute. I'd love for you to think about the last scene in a show or a movie that really got to you. And it wasn't the usual kind of tearjerker scene. And actually, if you want, drop that in the comments like, yeah, the scene was from this particular movie. And pay attention to what that scene was about. Because actually, the tearjerker scene and what evokes this from you can give you some real insight into your grief. Someone was actually recently sharing with me a scene in a film in which the lead character was a young woman. And the young woman had a deeply, like, sort of really warm, empathic, connected relationship with her father. And the father had a really wonderful sense of humor. He was empathic, he was available, and he made sacrifices for his family and for his children without drawing attention to them. He wasn't a victim, nothing like that. In an actual relatively ordinary scene, inconsequential scene in this movie, when the father brought a little birthday cake to the daughter on her wonderful birthday, this person was telling me she started crying. And people were looking at her seriously. And then she remembered crying again. And there was a scene where the father sacrificed an important opportunity to ask himself. He sacrificed his commitment in favor of his son. And she said she just couldn't stop crying. And she was caught off guard by her reaction to this. And even though she had given up on her own relationship with her narcissistic father a long time ago, the potency of the reaction after all these years, as it came through the film, struck her. And it's interesting because she was also going through a narcissistic abusive intimate relationship. But the never-ending grief of wishing it had been something different with her father, of wondering what a life with a non-rageful, empathic, giving, and open-hearted father would really like. She wondered, what would that be like? To recognize that she would go through this life without ever knowing that experience. That's grief. And as she beautifully put it, most days she didn't even think about it. She just lost her mind. She just sort of, her father had his life. He made almost no attempt to even maintain any kind of relationship with her whatsoever. And she herself had her own full life. But the grief was there, hidden away, and reacted through a simple story of a father and a daughter in a film. And it wasn't even supposed to be a father-daughter film. It was really sort of a sideline story in the film. When I think about the last time I cried during a TV show, it was actually during an absolutely absurd comedy show. And as the series comes to an end, these characters who had actually been really treated horribly and bullied by other people throughout the course of the series, they got very, very happy endings, and they succeeded on their own terms and really authentically. I watched this last episode, I started crying. And my children, because this is a comedy show, looked at me as though I had literally lost my mind. This was not meant to be a poignant scene. So as I went to bed that night, I wondered, what was it that made me so weepy at such a silly scene? And I had to say that I recognized that I identified with the scene. I identified with being told no. And this idea that you're never going to make it, or who do you think you are? And these characters, they retained their good humor all the way through the series. And for once, for one damn time, karma worked out the way you hope it does, because these characters are so sweet. And maybe, in my case, that's the toll of working on narcissistic abuse. Because so rarely the lives of the folks I've worked with, the story rarely ends up there. Maybe it wasn't about the happy ending of this silly show that made me cry, but it was actually the fact that it was a just ending. Because again, that is so rarely how it ends up for survivors of narcissistic abuse. Survivors of narcissistic abuse always have to look past the seeming injustice, actual injustice of the situation, and find a way to tell the story of their life in this relationship so it feels endurable and find some meaning in the grief. Because I grieve for the unfairness that is narcissistic abuse and see the ongoing toll it takes on people who really do almost read that sense of justice. So that said, I ask it again. Have you ever found yourself crying at an unexpected time in a movie? Not the tearjerker that gets everyone, but that scene, just like that sort of scene I'm telling you about, that really got you by surprise. What was that show? Maybe even what was that scene? And was it a place that gave you a glimpse into your narcissistic grief? That inning and outing from social media is a sort of abandonment dance, right? I won't let this space hurt me. I'm the boss of this space. I'm leaving. Well, kind of need it. I'm coming back. More validation. Lather, rinse, repeat. Social media, at least in my opinion, shifted the awareness on narcissism in a very, very new way. And social media is really the narcissistic person's playground, their weapon, their drug, and it really becomes a lens to understand the phenomenon of narcissism like no other. This brief series will, over time, take on the intersection of social media and narcissism, with my goal being that I want to help you understand how all of this may be affecting you. So I want this first video to almost be like a history lesson. What's fascinating about the place I've been in with this is that I'm old enough to have been studying narcissism since before there was ever social media. And it's interesting, as I was preparing and thinking about this video, I recognize there's moments you remember your entire life. And this moment was somewhere around 2007, 2008. I don't actually remember the date, but I remember it was at night. A friend of mine reached out and said, hey, have you ever heard of this thing called Facebook? And I'd actually never heard of it. I remember the friend sending me the message. It was late at night. Everyone was asleep. And I had like this quiet moment. I'm like, okay, let me go to this Facebook thing that this person is telling me about. And again, I had a rare quiet moment. I opened it up, I logged in, and I spent about 30 minutes poking around. It allowed me to find out what happened to people from my high school. I was sort of happy to see what happened to the mean girls. But after I kind of was entertained by it for a minute, I actually started to feel a little sick. Because it dawned on me that a primary function of this Facebook thing was a means by which people could get attention and validation for the various things they do. And mostly I saw that it was people sharing things like vacation pictures. Someone was sharing a picture of a cake they baked, the pictures of them all dressed up to go out on a night on the town. All of it was innocent enough, and none of the pages I was seeing were particularly offensive. Back, it was back in like 2007. But it was sort of strange because I noticed these people were sharing on a daily basis and people would like it, right? I felt sick because it dawned on me that the people with the narcissistic personalities were going to use this thing called Facebook for really unhealthy purposes. And that everyone was going to sort of fall in line with what the narcissists were doing. It was actually the day, and I remember it so well, it was the day that I realized that the narcissists, when this was all done, were going to win. Now, until the advent of social media, remember, Facebook began in 2004, MySpace, if any of you remember that began in 2003. Remember back in the day, old days, before 2003, for a narcissistic person to get validation, it was work. And they would get validation from much smaller audiences. A narcissistic person would actually kind of have to get cleaned up and leave the house and find real human beings. So narcissistic attention seeking was largely limited to the workplace, social gatherings, family gatherings, that kind of thing. And while one could argue on another note, if we talked about reality TV, for example, television shows like Candid Camera, which actually began in the 1940s, ask your parents about it, they were sort of early reality TV. The reality TV that we recognize today had its origins in the early 2000s. And shows like The Real World on MTV debuted in the 1990s. Certainly that double storm of reality TV, that idea that anyone can be temporarily famous if they behave badly enough, along with the other storm of social media. Anyone could get attention anytime. It took this backwater clinical phenomenon called narcissism that anyone in the know knew was toxic, but it wasn't mainstream. And it kicked narcissism up into one of the most important issues of our time. Now, before social media and reality TV, the narcissists were just lashing out at smaller groups of people and getting smaller scale validation. It was more of the grandiose posturing, arrogance, entitlement, unempathic, difficult to get along with manipulative types that were out there. A great example of one of these sort of circa 1960s narcissists would be someone like the character Don Draper in Mad Men, right? Yeah. Or there were those sullen, victimized narcissists out there too, but they had no audience. Those folks would just rage at their families, partners, and coworkers. Narcissistic folks might pick up something we used to call a movie star magazine, because those were once a thing, and I bet they would wonder what it would be like to be a famous person. But for all of us mere mortals, becoming famous did not at all seem accessible to anyone. So these people would just perform their narcissistic antics at their friend's party or in smaller places. When I think back to my years growing up as a child into adolescence, my experience of difficult and narcissistic people was more people who had lacked empathy, who were very abrupt or cold or had a critical, judgmental quality about them, or were very sensitive to any kind of feedback or criticism. But it really wasn't as pathologically attention-seeking as we see it now. Now, again, in the early 2000s, when social media came on the scene, that was it. The genie was out of the bottle. Never did we put back in. If someone could have literally sat in a lab and created the perfect tool for narcissistic people to sit somewhere and get the validation and supply they needed, validation and supply for everything, for buying their groceries, to making dinner, to a new dress, to a competitive posturing for having the best vacation, the best night out, the best kids, the best partner, the best life, that tool would have been social media. Early on, it became a curiosity. Like, that's how a lot of people used it in the early 2000s. It was, like I said, honestly, people were finding out what happened to people they went to high school with, or people who grew up on their street, or a long-lost family member. People were using it for things like sharing family photos. But in the blink of an eye, we entered a universe of influencers and population-wide manipulation, and frankly, a population-wide development of people developing their false selves. False selves that people believed were better than their real selves. And social media also created a universe where a lot of people were walking around the world all the time wondering if they were missing out on something better or if they were even good enough. And in that way, social media almost became like a narcissist. Social media left people feeling like they were not good enough. They were gaslighted, manipulated, full of self-doubt, full of confusion. Anyone on social media was basically in a narcissistically abusive relationship with social media. For people who had any kind of fragility around their sense of self, their self-worth, or their identity, social media was really a perilous, and is a perilous space. And social media started having and continues to have the same negative impact on people as narcissistic relationships do. And the narcissistic people, they own this space. Narcissistic people are better at maintaining their false self because they live in their false self. Social media became a home for them, a sort of mothership, to make it appear as though they were actually living the grandiose fantasy lives that up till then they were only living in their heads. They would talk about their aspirations as though they were actually happy. Snapping a selfie like, woke up this morning and thinking about starting my own multinational company. Click. But people would buy it as though they actually were running a multinational company. People were going on vacation solely to get images for Instagram. They were going to the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wall or the Great Pyramids or whatever beach or ocean is the beach of the moment to take a picture and show the world how great their lives are, rather than to do anything as absurd as actually take in the engineering of the Eiffel Tower or the scale of the Great Wall or the joy of being at the beach. An entire world was now going places to have their ass facing the place they came to see so they could get the selfie. The false self means that many narcissistic folks live in two realities. The reality that induces envy in other people and the reality that they actually live in, which is never is going to be as good. And as such, the narcissistic people in the age of social media live in a chronic, constant state of quiet rage, wanting their actual lives to be as good as the lives they portray on social media. They created this mess for themselves, and they still blame the world for not delivering on the super fabulous life they feel entitled to. And here we are. The genie is out of the bottle. An entire generation has been raised on social media. The minds have been manipulated, and there is no going backwards. When I was in graduate school back in the 1990s, we didn't really learn that much about narcissism. I have to say now, with all the shifts in the world, I believe that it has to be a required course if you are to be a mental health practitioner in the 21st century. And to understand the story of social media is to understand the impacts and damages and harms narcissism, and to some degree social media, are having on our lives, our psyches, and our minds. So hang on to your hats, because this series that'll unfold over the next few weeks and months will take on the landscape of social media and narcissism, so you can understand why this is an issue that is affecting so many of us. But interestingly, it may not have affected your parents' or grandparents' generations in the same ways. These are real generational leaps. It wasn't a thing in earlier generations. It's interesting. As a 55-year-old woman, I feel like I'm somebody who studied narcissism through the kind of that meteor that killed the dinosaurs. Remember, there was dinosaurs and there was a meteor and they weren't dinosaurs. There was a world. Then something happened, social media, meteor, whatever it was, and now there's a different world. And interestingly, the narcissists are the species that were able to make it through the meteor and now are evolving more rapidly in the post-meteor social media world. So I really look forward to sharing with you these issues with my hope in this series that it can help you understand social media and narcissism, but more importantly, be able to protect yourself and navigate the social media spaces where the narcissistic and the antagonistic people out there who often use social media as a battleground and as a weapon. And that's what it is for them. For many of the rest of us, it may just be a place to share a sweet picture of your cat. But before you do that, you need to recognize that the narcissistic folks out there have turned social media into a very unsafe space. My hope is through these videos to teach you how that happens. Okay, everyone. So here's a question for you. Is social media the reason narcissism has become the problem that it is in the world? What do you think? Please drop your answer in the comments. I wish you were all sitting right here so I could hear them from you, but I'll take what I can get. Now, I was actually at a gathering recently and was talking with a few people. And I remember one of the conversations was with someone I'm very close to and respect. And she said, I'm quoting, "I think social media is the worst thing that has ever happened in our lifetime." I was like, wow, that's a powerful line. She said she felt the harm that it has caused to people, how they view the world, how they view their lives, their self-esteem, and mental health. She feels that those negative impacts are unsurpassed by any other social influence before that. It was a big statement, but I got to tell you, it's a little more than a little bit true. And though I think it may be in a dead heat,
What are you
with some
doing?
other cultural, political, and social influences
You weirdo.
that have been around a lot longer than social media, those tend to be like philosophy, like economic systems or governmental systems, those kinds of things. Social media, though, is different. It's not a system, it's a tool, right? And it's a tool that has evolved only recently, and yet it has shaped us as a species in our lifetime. I always have to give myself a reality check. To give you sort of a trajectory, when I started as a university professor in 1999, it didn't exist. When I retired as a professor in 2021, it changed the entire social and educational landscape forever. I didn't grow up with it in the 1970s, thank heaven. It didn't exist when I had small children, thank heaven. It didn't exist when I started my academic career. It didn't exist when I was a student. So for me, social media doesn't really represent a normalized way to interact. It's like a language I didn't grow up speaking. So it just doesn't seem like a way I would communicate to people. And yes, you might be good at any online communication. No, I suck at texting. I am good at email though, but that's because I'm a letter writer from way back. It's like I'm typing a letter. So I'd love to know, drop a comment. At what stage of your life did social media become a major part of your life? It'll be interesting to see the different kinds of responses. Now this, however, begs the bigger question. Is social media responsible for what seems like a more narcissistic world? Now, let's face it, this is my YouTube channel, and the irony is not lost on me that this is a form of social media. But I'm going to take my bully pulpit for a minute and consider what I'm about to say, my opinion, and my opinion alone. The question is social media responsible for the uptick in overall narcissistic behavior in the world? My answer is yes. Listen, I always try to be a moderate and play the centrist party line. Social media, yeah, I know, it can create communities. It allows people who may have traditionally felt isolated to connect over common ground. It lets families stay in touch. It allows disparate people to share points of view. It allows people to share baby pictures and wedding pictures. Those things are true. And for people who only use it that way, good for you. I guess that's nice. But those assets, those gifts of social media, when we measure them against the harm, I'm sorry, to me the balance is still off. Social media is probably still more bad than good. I'm not even going to get into the harms of misinformation and all that stuff and the mental health kinds of impacts, especially on younger people. I'm going to stay strictly in the narcissism lane here. I do believe there is a decent chunk of people, I do, who use social media in a healthy manner to do the things I was talking about. Build community, stay in touch, cheer each other on, share updates with widely scattered social networks. People who have health issues may share support and feedback, share recipes, play silly games with each other. All of that feels harmless to me. I also believe there's a pretty damn decent chunk of people who use social media in a manner that can be called perpetrating. They use it to stalk people, to bully people, to share harmful information. The research on cyberbullying clearly shows the impact of attacking people using social media or other online or text spaces has the same and potentially worse impact as in-person bullying. Trolling, stalking, online bullying, all of this behavior is very much something that's often perpetrated by narcissistic individuals. So here's another place for a comment. Do you feel like the toxic people on social media that you run into have had a negative impact on your well-being? Sadly, there are people whose mental health is negatively impacted by social media. They may be the recipients of bullying and harassment and develop symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. There are those who look at it and socially compare themselves to others, and this intersects with other mental health and self-esteem issues, and can result in these people feeling significantly less than other people, depressed, anxious, hopeless, worthless, unattractive, and can culminate in a frank psychological crisis, especially in younger people. In the most serious cases, exposures to these kinds of things can culminate in self-harm or suicidal behavior. And I definitely believe that social media is a tool that is designed to foster and proliferate narcissism. It is designed for people to solicit validation, to post a false narrative about themselves and about their own lives, to manipulate other people, to insult and demean other people, to share a life that is actually about some sort of created aspirational self rather than their true authentic self. So it gives the narcissistic person a public playground to do the things that they do best. And that in and of itself is not the issue. That by itself would not result in the proliferation of narcissistic behavior throughout society. The issue is that all of that preening or posturing and posting and sharing and selfieing and look at how much better my life is than yours is rewarded. In the last 10 years or so, we have devolved into the commodified world of the consumerist influencer. People who spend their days sharing about what they ate for breakfast, their children, their vacations, their pranks, complete with hashtags in a chronic hunt for sponsors, free stuff, and followers. It's a strategy and it's a game. And people's jobs are designed to get these people followers. This isn't an even playing field. It's also a business. And here's the thing. I don't look at an advertisement on television or in a magazine thinking that that's real life or that I could be like those people. I know it's an advertisement. But in the new validation-seeking influencer culture, people are behaving as though the people in those pictures who they may identify as their friends those are their real lives when they're advertising. And that confuses people who look at these photos, especially those who may be more impressionable, maybe younger, or more vulnerable to those forms of manipulation. Once the people who are using social media for narcissistic peaks to buy were getting amply rewarded for it, with money, with notoriety, with stuff, and then the subsequent power, now that was really when social media became the accelerant for societal narcissism. And it resulted in a social media world of narcissistic people and the people who fall for the narcissistic false narrative and who unwittingly became the enabler. And there's a whole group of vulnerable folks out there, especially adolescents and children. People who are vulnerable in other ways, for example, they may be very suggestible. They may struggle with mental health issues. They may struggle with self-esteem issues. These are all people who don't know how all of this racket works and are more easy to please or play. And they're all being narcissistic abused on a larger scale. These same vulnerable folks are using social media as a place to make their own calls for help or issues they're experiencing, which can often mean that these users are yelling into the wrong abyss, and it pulls them off the path of getting the appropriate help that they really need. We are about to hit the first generation of emerging adults, people going from adolescence into adults, who were born into a world in which social media existed from the day they were born. So their parents used it when they were infants. Their childhoods were exhaustively documented on social media. It existed for their entire lives. Now the jury is out on how this will manifest with regard to not only narcissism,
What are you
but
doing?
also mental health and identity development in general. The data that will emerge in the next few years is going to be fascinating. Now, the portrayal of the false self is the narcissist's ground game. They do it better than any of us. As a therapist, it is often painful to watch the hurt that people experience because they look at social media and they see that they weren't included in a social get together because they see the pictures posted during and after the event, or the insecurity that emanates from new mothers, that emanates from seeing the perfection of a peer's children, or the success of a peer's career,
What
or
are you
even how
doing?
well the baby sleeping during the night. The isolation and weight of observing families have big holiday get-togethers and matching outfits when
What are
people
you
do
doing?
not have that kind of connection to their family. The yearning that comes from watching anniversary stories and love stories and wedding stories while a person is navigating their own divorce. Now we're all becoming a little savvier at how we consume and look at social media. Many of us know what's true. We know what's manufactured. But in our weakest moments, even when it is another person's embellished narrative, we're vulnerable to believing it, and it hurts. Ostracism, a sense of being left out, is a universal fear and a universal worry for all of us. Long before social media, narcissistic individuals have been really good at constructing their false self, the self that they believe the world wants to see, to set goals that are considered admirable by other people, to sell themselves as doing better than they actually are, and certainly better than everyone else is. Now with social media, they have a theater to perform these false selves in. Once upon a time, narcissistic folks were stuck with just getting validation from the small band of people they knew.
No?
Now, it's a different case. They can get validation from the world, which emboldens them even more. And the enablers believe the false narrative, which gives the narcissistic host even more power. So, yep, you better believe it.
No.
Even alongside that friend
We're off on the phone
I
call
do
today.
believe that social media is a catalyst for what has become a proliferation of narcissism
No.
and enablement in our society.
No?
In a way, the only path
Really?
forward is to see social media as the fictional bulletin
There you
board
go.
that it is, a sort of theater of
Hey.
the absurd, a time capsule of what matters to people, but not what is really happening. But it could also be a place to perhaps stop rewarding the narcissistic people by starting simple. Simple things like just stop liking their stuff. Stop feeling the need to praise it. As a place to learn how to set boundaries. So since that isn't going to happen anytime soon, even outside of social media, everyone needs to be more careful. Nowadays, you are more likely to meet narcissistic people in general, in the workplace, at school, on dating apps, on dating anything, in social settings, at family reunions, on the city bus, on an airplane, on a tour bus, in a casino, anywhere. Social media ain't going anywhere. And let's face it, the narcissistic folks rule the space. So again, I'm Dr. Romney, and I would love to hear from you. How have you changed your social habits and media habits to cut narcissistic people out of your life? So we have to learn to be more tactical in how we navigate the world. Learn the red flags, practice setting boundaries, watch those cognitively dissonant patterns like justification that we so often fall back into.
Freedom of speech is a fundamental right in any free and democratic society. But what happens when expressing your opinions gets you into serious trouble? Dr. Jordan Peterson, the famous psychologist and professor, was confronted with this very dilemma. After voicing his perspectives on political issues in Canada, Peterson was hit with complaint after complaint to the regulatory college that oversees psychologists in Ontario. Suddenly, his ability to work as a psychologist was under threat. In this video, Dr. Peterson pulls back the curtain on the complaints against
Ready to go?
and his right to continue his work as a psychologist. His story raises profound questions about the erosion of civil liberties, the corruption of public institutions, and the
Oh my fucking god, why is everything so fucking slow today, god damn it.
where I have to defend my right to practice my profession, and I would say especially with my education pedigree. I mean, Jesus, I was a professor at Harvard.